Hello everybody, my name is Nootmad and welcome back to another Borderlands 4 Amon build video, and today we're going over my Ordamon Amon Ordnance build. Now, as the name may suggest, this build is very focused on heavy ordnance and spamming that for bossing and mobbing. Now, as you saw in the clips just before this, bossing is done very well and mobbing is also a piece of cake as well, and we're able to do this through a few skill synergies that would make a fair bit of sense once you look into it. So, and for starters, we can look at the skill trees. So, to no surprise, this is a mishmash of the Vengeance and Calamity skill trees with some burner points dumped into the Cybernetics tree. However, you can also put these points anywhere else that you see fit. So, we can start with the Vengeance skill tree, and pretty straightforward skill picks here. We have Wrath of Nature. What Wrath of Nature does is it gives us increased status effect chance and cry effectiveness. This cry effectiveness doesn't really matter for this build, but what does matter is the status application chance. And because this build uses skills like Blackout and Tail of the Comet to apply cry status effects or status effects in general, we want to try and make sure that we can maximize the chances of it applying to enemies and get other damage bonuses out of that. We then have Scorch Kairos. Once again, this is the Ordnance build, so it makes sense to pick up Scorch Kairos to get our increased Ordnance damage and magazine size as well. This does help for some ordinances that have a smaller magazine size, which helps with spamming. We then have Tail of the Comet. Now this is one of the powerhouses of this build, and what this does is whenever Amon deals Ordnance damage, it gives him a chance to apply a Cry status effect that deals Cry damage over time for a duration, which is pretty obvious. But the damage off the Cry damage tick is very significant, as it scales directly off the damage you deal, which is really useful. And if we're trying to maximize the initial damage hits off each of our bullets, Tail of the Comet scales incredibly well. Now that's it for the branch, and for the branch 3 we have Blackout, max it out at 5 out of 5. What Blackout does is it gives us a chance to crit with the ordnance damage, so any ordnance bullets that we fire or any ordnance projectiles can now have a chance to crit. And when it does crit, it deals a massive shock dot, 75% damage off the damage total. So similar story to Tail of the Comet, because we're trying to maximize the initial damage hit off our weapons, picking up skills like Blackout, for example, that scales directly off that damage to apply damage over time, works very nicely. So that's it for the Vengeance tree. We then move into the Calamity tree. Now this one is where things get a little bit different, and we start with what burns within. Now, to be honest, this is a bit of a burn skill, but it does make sense when you look at the other things that we pick in. So what burns within gives Amon increased interior damage, 30%. We then have Wield the Storm. What Wield the Storm does is it gives us increased status effect damage and status effect duration. This means that our dots do more damage and last longer, which helps to get bonuses from things like Electrify and Catastrophe, which we'll talk about very soon. But yeah, because this build is focused on ordnance and damage over time, we try and boost these things as much as we can. But the next skill we have Gut Punch, pretty straightforward pick. Gut Punch gives us a weakened debuff for the enemies that we shoot from both our melee and ordnance damage. The melee doesn't really matter for this build, but the ordnance damage does, because we're spamming it a lot. We're going to try and maximize applying this to bosses, which means they take more damage, 20% to be exact. So that's it for tier 2. For the tier 3, we only need to sink a couple more points to keep moving down into the branches, and here's where we put 2 points into Bullet Storm. And what Bullet Storm does is whenever we apply a status effect, we gain increased gun damage. Now, gun damage boosts our ordnance damage, which is really nice, so we try and boost this where we can, provided we're not compromising it in any other places. So that's it for the branch, and for the trunk. And moving into the branch, we have a few skills here. So we have Catastrophe. Now, if you guys have watched a few of my other build videos, this comes as no surprise. Catastrophe is an incredibly useful utility skill and damage skill. For this, whenever Amon applies shock to an enemy, you gain increased critical hit chance, and whenever Amon applies burning to an enemy, you gain increased critical hit damage. Now, because we have Blackout in the Vengeance tree, which gives us shock, basically more or less guaranteed, because we're going to be constantly spamming it, we can always guarantee that we have our critical hit chance up. And because we have Electrical Fire, which basically means that whenever Amon shocks an enemy, he burns them, and whenever he burns an enemy, he shocks them, we also get the burning buff from this as well, so we get the free critical hit damage as well. We then have 2 points into Dragon's Breath. This is mainly because we needed to sink points to get to Electrical Fire, and just 2 points here doesn't really matter much. We're not really doing much melee damage, nor are we using a melee ordnance, so we can't really make much use out of Fist of Stone. And once again, not really melee focus, so we don't really need judgment. So then we have 3 points in Crackling Aegis, and what this does, it increases our status effect damage and ordnance damage based on the shields that we have. And yeah, to go to Electrical Fire, we're using 2 points of the Dragon's Breath, which does help anyway. It gives us an increased damage boost, and this counts as amp as well. So in terms of a damage formula, we're trying to maximize this here as well. And then we have Electrical Fire, which we already spoke about. So yeah, we can then look into the burner points. So we have 3 points in Executioner here, which is it gives us increased crit damage, and we're not really doing much melee damage, so it doesn't really matter. But so we're basically getting a 12% crit hit damage, while it does seem a bit small. You can put 3 points into Dragon's Breath and just max it at 5 out of 5, or you can put points to something like Bloodlust, for example, or you can maximize Bullet Storm. Entirely up to you. I just thought this would be a decent idea to have a little bit extra crit damage, but you can also put 3 points into here, and maximize the gun damage bonus you get from applying a status effect. Now, looking over to the gear selection for this build, the primary weapons don't really matter because we can use ordnances for mobbing just as effectively as a primary weapon. So since we're talking about weapons, we'll just start talking about the ordnances. So this build has 2 different sort of options you can use. One is for bossing and one is for mobbing. If you're doing bossing, I highly suggest the honey bunches. Now this weapon can also roll in elements as well, so try and get the matching elements for the boss that you're trying to kill. I haven't been so lucky, so I've just stuck with kinetic, but don't be just sort of dismissive of the damage potential because you can't element match. In all the clips that I had at the start of this video, that was all done with this specific ordnance without any elemental matching. So if you can imagine what the damage would be if I could actually element match, yeah, you can sort of see where that's going. So this is the weapon that I suggest for any sort of bossing. This is a well drop, so there's no real dedicated source, so you basically have to pray to RNGesus that you get this gun dropping from any sort of boss that you can farm somewhat reliably. In terms of parts, the triple barrel helps a lot, mainly because you can charge this up and amp it to just fire a bunch of rockets at once, barrage the enemy or the boss, and they die very, very quickly. So that's for the bossing choice. For the mobbing choice, I highly suggest the bottled lightning. Now, if you've seen my Swiss Army knife Amon build, I do use the bottled lightning quite a bit for my mobbing options, mainly because this is just incredibly useful. All the lightning projectiles that you shoot can chain to enemies and apply dots. Because we have things like Electrify and Catastrophe, we're maximizing the dot damage onto the enemies so they melt very quickly. So this is just a very useful gun to have for mobbing as well. Now, even though there's only 3 bullets in the magazine, because we have a class mod that gives us endless bombardment, which we'll talk about shortly, you can basically keep this up more or less infinitely. So very useful to have. So yeah, bottle lightning for any sort of mobbing, and the honey bunches for any sort of bossing that you need to. So that's the ordnance. In terms of the rep kit that we use the triple bypass, and this should come as no surprise. The triple bypass is an incredibly useful rep kit to have, and because we have the ability to replenish this very quickly on kill, we can try and amp as many shots as we can in our mobbing situations. In our bossing, 1 rep kit stim is all we need, as you can see in the clips at the start of this video. But yeah, we use this the amp part to increase the amount of damage that we can deal in a single shot. Now, for the class one, like I was saying before, we have a cyborg class one with as many points as possible into endless bombardment. Now, what does endless bombardment do? It's a skill in the cybernetics tree that gives Amon the chance for heavy ordnances to refund 1 ammo on damaging enemies. Now, because the bottle lightning does a whole bunch of tick damage and it chains to a bunch of enemies as it passes through mobs, each of those hits on enemies has a chance to replenish the ammo in the magazine for the bottle lightning, meaning that you can keep bullets into the magazine as much as you can. So that's why we have the cyborg class mod. In terms of passive rolls you can have, gun damage and ordnance crit hit chance are very useful. Gun damage adds to the overall damage soup, and ordnance crit hit chance, well, it's crit hit chance, we're maximizing this where we can, increase the overall damage for our ordnances where possible. From a shield perspective, we have the protein cell. This is what I suggest for bossing, but if you're mobbing, I suggest the What's for Dinner, which is somewhat of a weaker version of the protein cell, but the elemental bonus shock damage that you get from the What's for Dinner can be applied very easily, or you can get that very easily and maintain that somewhat reliably. For bossing, however, the Protean Cell is incredibly useful, mainly because of the bonus shock damage that can apply globally to any sort of damage sources. So yeah, that's the shield that we use for bossing. And for the enhancement, now this is entirely up to you as to what manufacturer you use, depending on the ordinances that you choose to use. However, I'm mainly focused on the passive stats for mine, and what I really needed is the gun damage enhancement passive stat, because this adds to the damage soup and basically increases the amount of damage that you can dish out. So the enhancement basically is up to you, match it to whatever weapons that you're using, but what is incredibly important is things like gun damage and weapon splash that can be applied to your weapons. Now, in terms of firmware, I highly suggest having 2 points in high caliber to get the projectile speed, well, once quarter of your life, but also to get us to that free gun damage bonus as well. And 2 points in Gadget Ahoy. This is because it helps us get our ordnance cooldown much quicker. Now, while I did say that you can loop it very easily with Endless Bombardment, I've been lucky enough to have 5 points in Endless Bombardment, but I know not everyone might be as lucky. So maybe you have 2 or 3 points, which you can still reliably mob, but in time instances where you can't get it up as much as you can, having cooldown duration helps. And then the second point here gives us 20% extra ordnance damage, which obviously no one's going to laugh at, and just adds to the overall damage soup that we have. From a specializations perspective, we're not really reinventing the wheel here. This is an ordnance based build, so we pick specializations that tie in nicely with that. We start with fragmentation payload. This gives our ordnances a chance to crit and also increase the crit hit damage off that resultant crit. We then have in the zone. When aiming, the Vault Hunter gains increased gun damage and critical hit damage per second. The bonuses are lost after 2 seconds of not aiming, but because we're going to be aiming down sights with the ordinances before we shoot it, we're building up a little bit of gun damage, which does help for the final damage that we deal to the boss. We then have full spectrum arsenal, which gives us extra ordnance damage based on the increases to gun damage. So once again, things like the gun damage passive stats and any skills that boost gun damage fall into this soup to give us extra ordnance damage. So that's just a free ordnance damage boost based on the investments that we have in gun damage. Then we have Tripwire. This just reduces our ordnance cooldown whenever action skill is activated. This is more of a quality of life thing. Like I said before, if you aren't as lucky to have 5 points in Endless Bombardment in your class mod, that specialization can help a little bit to keep things up and running and keep that gameplay loop going. So yeah, that's pretty much it for the build. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll be putting out a few more builds and guides over the next coming weeks, so if you're new to the channel, feel free to subscribe. If you have any questions about this build, let me know in the comments down below, but if not, take care and I'll catch you guys in the next one. See ya.